My name is Declan McRitty, former Navy SEAL turned hospital security guard. 72 hours ago, I was covering the shift at St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix when patients started eating the medical staff alive. What began as a routine Tuesday afternoon became a fight for survival against an enemy my 12 years of combat experience never prepared me for. The infected don't follow the rules of war, and they don't stop coming. This is how I survived the first 3 days of the zombie outbreak. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Declan McRitty, and I need you to understand something right from the start. In my 12 years as a Navy SEAL, I saw combat in some of the worst places on earth. I watched good men die in ways that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. I thought I understood violence, thought I knew what fear looked like. In a human being's eyes, I was wrong about everything. 3 days ago, I was just another veteran trying to make sense of civilian life. I had a small apartment near the San Diego harbor, split my time between private security contracts and teaching sailing lessons to kids from the local community center. The VA therapist I'd been seeing twice a week told me I was making real progress with my PTSD. She said my nightmares were becoming less frequent, that I was learning to process what happened during my final deployment in Syria. Looking back now, those sessions with Dr. Martinez probably saved my life in ways she never could have imagined. But on March 15th, I wasn't in San Diego. I was in Phoenix, Arizona, covering a security shift at St. Mary's General Hospital. For my buddy Jake, who'd called me the night before practically crying into the phone about food poisoning from some sketchy sushi place. Jake worked hospital security part-time, just like a lot of us former military guys do. It's steady work, the hours aren't terrible, and most of the time you're just walking corridors and checking doors. Easy money, or so I thought. I remember driving to the hospital that morning, feeling off somehow. You know that sensation when your skin feels too tight, when every sound seems a little too loud, when your peripheral vision keeps catching movement that isn't there? Combat veterans learn to trust those feelings. Your subconscious picks up on danger signals before your rational mind can process them. In Iraq and Afghanistan, that instinct kept me alive more times than I can count. That Tuesday morning, driving through Phoenix traffic, that same alarm was going off in my head, but I couldn't figure out why. The hospital seemed normal enough when I arrived just after 7 in the morning. St. Mary's is a mid-sized facility. Nothing fancy but well-maintained, serving the northwest part of Phoenix. I checked in with the day supervisor, a retired cop named Rodriguez who ran a tight ship. He walked me through the basic routine, showed me the patrol routes, explained the radio codes. Standard stuff, though he did mention something that stuck with me later. Rodriguez told me they'd had an unusual number of patients coming in overnight with what the doctors were calling severe food poisoning or possibly a new strain of flu. Nothing too alarming, he said, but the A was busier than normal for a Tuesday. He also mentioned that some of the overnight patients had been unusually aggressive, requiring restraints and sedation. At the time, I figured it was just people being difficult when they felt sick. Hospitals bring out the worst in some folks. The morning passed quietly enough. I did my rounds, checked the parking areas, helped a few lost visitors find their way around. The only thing that seemed out of place was how many staff members looked tired. Not just end-of-shift tired, but genuinely exhausted, like they'd been running on adrenaline for hours. I caught fragments of conversations between nurses and doctors in the hallways, medical terminology I didn't understand but delivered in tones that suggested something was wrong. Around 10:30, I was doing a routine check of the 3rd floor when I noticed something that made my training kick in. Room 302 housed an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson who was recovering from hip replacement surgery. I'd met her earlier when she'd asked me to help her reach the TV remote. Sweet lady, probably in her 70s, reminded me of my grandmother. But when I walked past her room that morning, she was standing at her window with her back to me, completely motionless. Now you might think that's nothing unusual. Patients look out windows all the time. But Mrs. Henderson was standing without any support, which was impossible given her recent surgery. She should have been in bed or using a walker. At minimum. More than that, something about her posture was wrong. Her shoulders were too rigid, her head tilted at an angle that looked uncomfortable. I almost went in to check on her, but another patient's call light went off down the hall, and I got distracted. I wish I'd trusted my instincts and gone into that room. Maybe I could have figured out what was happening before it spread. Maybe I could have saved some lives. But I didn't, and by the time I realized what I was really looking at, it was too late for a lot of people. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came just after lunch. I was restocking some basic supplies on the 3rd floor. Mind wandering to weekend plans when the screaming started. Not the usual hospital sounds, you understand. Hospitals are noisy places. People cry, they call out in pain. Family members get emotional. You learn to tune out most of it. But this was different. This was the sound a person makes when they're not just in pain, but in mortal terror. The screaming was coming from the emergency department 2 floors below, echoing up through the stairwells and elevator shafts. It started with one voice, then 2, then what sounded like half a dozen people all crying out at once. I grabbed my radio to call it in, but before I could key the mic, every speaker in the building crackled to life with an announcement I'd never heard before. Code Silver, Code Silver. All personnel to secure positions immediately. I'd been working hospital security for 2 months, and I'd memorized every emergency code in the manual. Code Blue for cardiac arrest. Code Red for fire. Code Gray for combative patient. Code White for pediatric emergency. But Code Silver wasn't in any manual I'd read. The tone of the announcement was wrong too. Usually, hospital pages are calm and professional, designed not to panic patients or visitors. This announcement had an edge to it, like whoever was speaking was barely keeping control of their own voice. I started moving toward the stairwell, but before I could reach it, the door slammed open and Marcus, one of the other security guards, stumbled through. Marcus was a good guy, former Army MP, usually unflappable. But he was pale as paper and shaking as he spoke into his radio. We need backup on the ground floor now. Multiple casualties, and I don't know how to describe what I'm seeing down here. These people are attacking each other, but something's wrong with them. They're not responding to commands. They're not responding to pain. Jesus Christ, what is wrong with these people? His transmission cut to static. Marcus looked up at me, and I could see genuine fear in his eyes. In all my years of combat, in all the dangerous situations I'd been in, I'd learned to read fear in a person's face. There's normal fear, the kind that keeps you alert and makes you careful. Then there's the kind of fear that comes when a trained professional realizes they're facing something completely outside their experience. That was what I saw in Marcus's face. I told him I was heading down to help, but he grabbed my arm and shook his head. He said the elevators were shut down, that someone had barricaded the main stairwell from the inside, and that he'd barely made it up the east staircase before whatever was happening down there had spread to the 2nd floor. He said we needed to get to the roof and call for police backup, maybe SWAT. That's when my combat training really kicked in. When you're a SEAL, you learn to assess threats quickly and make decisions based on incomplete information. Everything Marcus was telling me suggested we were dealing with some kind of mass casualty event, possibly terrorism, possibly a chemical attack that was affecting people's behavior. The smart play was to get to high ground, establish communication with outside authorities, and wait for backup. But I had to see for myself what we were dealing with. I told Marcus to head for the roof, and try to raise someone on the radio while I did a quick reconnaissance of the situation below. He started to argue, but I reminded him that I had more combat experience and that somebody needed to gather intelligence about what exactly was happening. I took the east stairwell down to the second floor, moving slowly and quietly. The stairwell was empty, but I could hear sounds from the other side of the door that made my skin crawl. Moaning, but not the kind you hear from patients in pain. This was lower, more guttural, almost animal-like. There were also sounds of struggle, furniture being knocked over, and what sounded like people running. I cracked the stairwell door, just enough to see into the second-floor corridor. What I saw there changed everything I thought I knew about the hallway looked like a war zone. Medical equipment was scattered everywhere, 4 stands knocked over, ceiling tiles fallen to the floor. There was blood on the walls, not just drops but actual smears and handprints like someone had been dragged. But what really got my attention were the people. 3 figures were moving through the corridor, but they weren't walking normally. Their movements were jerky and uncoordinated, like they were drunk or suffering from some kind of neurological condition. One of them was wearing a hospital gown, probably a former patient. Another was in scrubs, likely a nurse or orderly. The third was in civilian clothes, maybe a visitor. But it was their faces that told me we weren't dealing with any kind of normal medical emergency. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their eyes were completely wrong. I've looked into the eyes of enemy combatants, people who wanted to kill me, people who were high on combat drugs or religious fanaticism, but these eyes were different. They were empty but somehow still aware, like looking at a predator that was hunting purely on instinct. As I watched, one of them, the person in the hospital gown, suddenly turned toward my hiding spot behind the door. They tilted their head like they were listening, then started moving in my direction with what I can only describe as purpose. Not the confused wandering of someone who was sick or disoriented, but the focused movement of something that had detected prey. I let the door close quietly and moved back up the stairs. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd seen and fit it into some kind of rational framework. Mass hysteria? Chemical weapon? Some kind of experimental drug that had gotten into the hospital supply? I'd seen people do terrible things to each other in combat, but this felt different. This felt like something fundamental had changed about these people. When I reached the 3rd floor, I found that Marcus had gathered several other staff members. There was Tony, one of the maintenance workers, a guy in his 50s who knew every inch of the hospital's infrastructure. There were 2 nurses from the cardiac unit, Sarah and Kim, both experienced professionals who'd probably seen everything you could see in a hospital. And there was another security guard named Pete, who'd been working the north wing when everything started. They were all talking at once, comparing stories about what they'd seen. Sarah said several patients on her floor had become violent without warning, attacking staff and other patients. Kim mentioned that some of the people who'd been hurt in these attacks had stopped breathing, been declared dead, then gotten back up and started attacking others. Pete said he'd seen a doctor get cornered by 3 people in the supply room, and when he'd tried to help, all 4 of them had turned on him. I gathered everyone around and told them what I'd seen on the 2nd floor. Then I made the decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of trying to fight our way down to the main exits, we were going to the roof. High ground is always preferable in a combat situation. It gives you visibility, limits the directions from which you can be attacked, and makes it easier for rescue forces to reach you. Tony knew the way to the roof access, and he led us up 2 more flights to a heavy metal door that opened onto the hospital's flat rooftop. The first thing I did was establish a perimeter, positioning everyone away from the roof access points, and checking to make sure the door we'd come through could be secured from our side. The second thing I did was try to raise someone on the radio. The radio traffic was chaos. Multiple hospitals across Phoenix were reporting similar incidents. Police dispatch was overwhelmed with calls about violent disturbances, people attacking each other in the streets, car accidents caused by drivers who'd apparently lost control of their vehicles for no apparent reason. But what really got my attention was when I heard military chatter starting to mix in with the civilian emergency traffic. I recognized some of the tactical language from my SEAL days. Units being deployed for crowd control, references to biological containment protocols, orders to establish quarantine perimeters. Whatever was happening wasn't limited to our hospital. It was spreading across the entire city, maybe beyond. From the roof, we had a clear view of Phoenix stretching out in all directions. Even in the early afternoon sunlight, we could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the city. There were more sirens than I'd ever heard at one time, creating a constant wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Traffic on the major highways was backing up as people tried to leave the city, but even from our distance, we could see that some of the traffic jams weren't normal. Cars were stopped at odd angles, some had clearly crashed, and there were people moving between the vehicles in ways that didn't look right. Sarah asked me what I thought was happening, and I had to admit I didn't know. But I told her what my training had taught me about crisis situations. First priority was immediate safety, which meant staying on the roof and away from whatever was happening inside the hospital. Second priority was gathering information and trying to establish communication with outside authorities. Third priority was planning for different scenarios, including the possibility that help might not come as quickly as we hoped. That last part turned out to be more important than any of us realized at the time. As the afternoon wore on, we watched the city's emergency response system begin to break down. Helicopter traffic decreased instead of increased. The radio chatter became more desperate and less organized. We saw military vehicles moving through the streets, but instead of the organized deployment you'd expect, they seemed to be retreating from certain areas. Around 4 o'clock, we witnessed something that made it clear we were dealing with a threat unlike anything any of us had imagined. A police helicopter was circling about half a mile from the hospital, probably doing reconnaissance or trying to coordinate ground units. Suddenly, it changed course and started moving erratically. Even from our distance, we could see it was in trouble. The helicopter made a hard turn, then another, then started losing altitude rapidly. We watched it crash into a shopping center parking lot, and within minutes, we could see people running away from the crash site. But some of the people weren't running away. Some were moving toward the wreckage in that same unnatural gait I'd seen in the hospital corridor. And as we watched through Tony's binoculars, we could see that the people fleeing the crash were being chased. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with a medical emergency or even a terrorist attack. We were facing something that was spreading from person to person, something that was turning normal people into predators. I didn't have a name for it yet, didn't understand the mechanism, but I understood the tactical situation. We were trapped in a city that was falling apart, surrounded by an enemy that was growing stronger while our potential rescuers were being overwhelmed. As the sun started to set, Tony mentioned something that had been bothering him all day. Earlier that morning, before his shift started, he'd noticed bite marks on his hand from what he thought was an equipment malfunction in the basement. Just a small puncture wound, nothing that seemed serious at the time. But as the day went on, it had started to hurt more, and now it was looking infected. I examined the wound, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The skin around the bite was turning gray, the same color I'd seen on the faces of the people in the corridor below. Tony said he was feeling dizzy and nauseous, but he attributed it to stress and not eating lunch. I didn't tell him what I was really thinking, but I started planning for the possibility that we might have an infected person in our group. The implications were terrifying. If whatever was affecting people could spread through bites, and if Tony had been bitten hours ago, then we might be looking at an incubation period. We might be sharing our secure position with someone who was going to turn into one of those things, but I couldn't just kick him off the roof based on a suspicion. He was still rational, still helping with our defense preparations, still the same person he'd been that morning. As night fell over Phoenix, the sounds from the city changed. The sirens became less frequent, but we started hearing other sounds. Shouting that carried on the night air, sometimes screams, sometimes what sounded like entire crowds of people moving through the streets. The lights of the city started going out in sections, not the rolling blackouts you might see during a power emergency, but irregular dark patches that suggested infrastructure was failing. We took turns keeping watch through the night, 2 people awake at all times while the others tried to rest. During my watch with Kim, around 2 in the morning, we heard sounds from inside the hospital that confirmed our decision to stay on the roof had been correct. Banging, crashing, what sounded like dozens of people moving through the corridors. Below us, at one point, we heard something trying to force open the roof access door, but the lock held. Kim asked me if I thought help was coming, and I gave her the most honest answer I could. I told her that in my experience, when a crisis gets bad enough, the authorities have to focus on protecting the areas they can still control rather than rescuing people in areas they've lost. It was possible that our part of the city had been written off, at least temporarily, while emergency responders tried to contain the spread of whatever was happening. But I also told her about my boat at the marina in San Diego, about the survival skills I'd learned in the military, about the fact that we were all still alive and thinking clearly while a lot of people in the city weren't. We had advantages. We had time to plan, and we had each other. As long as we stayed smart and didn't take unnecessary risks, we had a chance of getting through this. What I didn't tell her was that I was already starting to form a plan that would take us away from the hospital and toward what I hoped would be safety. I was thinking about the marina, about boats in open water, about places where whatever was spreading through the city couldn't follow us. But first, we had to survive the night, and we had to deal with Tony, whose condition was getting worse by the hour. By dawn, it would become clear just how much worse things could get, and how quickly a survival situation could turn into something else entirely. But for now, we were alive, we were together, and we were learning the first harsh lesson of what would turn out to be the longest 72 hours of our lives. The sun came up on March 16th, and with it came the realization that the world we'd known was gone. From the hospital roof, Phoenix looked like a different city. Smoke was rising from at least a dozen locations, some of the fires big enough that we could see flames even from miles away. The highways that had been packed with fleeing traffic the day before were now graveyards of abandoned vehicles. Even more disturbing were the groups of people we could see moving through the streets in the early morning light, not walking with any apparent destination but wandering in loose clusters that reminded me of pack animals. Tony had gotten worse during the night. The bite on his hand was now obviously infected, the skin around it turning that same gray color I'd seen on the people in the hospital corridor. He was running a fever, sweating heavily despite the cool morning air, and his speech was starting to slur slightly. But he was still Tony, still the maintenance worker who knew every inch of the hospital, still trying to help us figure out our next move. Sarah, one of the nurses, wanted to treat his wound with supplies from the hospital, but that would mean going back inside the building. From the sounds we'd heard during the night, the interior was no longer safe. Kim suggested we could lower someone down from the roof on a rope to access supplies through a window, but Tony himself argued against it. He said he felt fine, just tired and maybe coming down with something. Even as his condition deteriorated, he was more concerned about the rest of us than himself. The radio traffic had changed overnight. Instead of the chaotic emergency calls we'd heard the day before, there were now longer periods of silence broken by brief, cryptic transmissions. Military units reporting position changes. Police dispatchers calling for officers who didn't respond. Most disturbing were the automated broadcasts that had started playing on several frequencies, repeating the same message every 30 minutes about emergency shelters and quarantine procedures. Around 7 in the morning, we saw our first clear indication of how badly the situation had deteriorated. A National Guard convoy appeared on the main road leading to the hospital, 5 vehicles moving in formation toward our position. For a moment, we thought rescue had arrived. Sarah actually stood up and started waving, trying to get their attention. But as the convoy got closer, something was obviously wrong. The vehicles were moving too fast, and their formation was sloppy. Military convoys maintain strict spacing and positioning, especially in potentially hostile territory. These vehicles were bunched together like they were fleeing something, rather than conducting an organized operation. When they reached the hospital parking lot, instead of stopping to establish a perimeter or begin evacuation procedures, they kept going, speeding past without even slowing down. Through Tony's binoculars, I could see why they weren't stopping. The hospital parking lot was full of people, dozens of them, all moving with that same unnatural gait we'd observed the day before. Some were in hospital gowns, probably patients who had been infected and then wandered outside. Others were in street clothes, likely people who had come to the hospital seeking help and instead found something else entirely. But what made my blood run cold was that I recognized some of them. There was Mrs. Henderson from room 302, the sweet elderly woman who had asked me to help her with the TV remote. She was moving through the parking lot with the same jerky, predatory motion as the others, and when she turned in our direction, I could see that her eyes had the same empty but hunting expression I'd seen in the corridor the day before. The National Guard convoy disappeared around a bend in the road, and we never heard from them again. Whatever command structure had sent them our way was either gone or had written off our area as a loss. We were on our own, and we were surrounded by an enemy that had once been our friends, neighbors, and patients. Pete, the other security guard, asked me what I thought we should do. He'd been in the Army before working hospital security, but his experience was in logistics, not combat. He was looking to me for leadership, and I could see the same expectation in the eyes of the others. My SEAL training had prepared me for a lot of situations, but being the decision maker for a group of civilians trapped in a city overrun by infected people wasn't exactly covered in the manual. I told them we needed to think about this tactically. Our current position was defensible, but not sustainable. We had no food, no water except what we could collect if it rained, and no medical supplies. Tony's condition was getting worse, and we couldn't rule out the possibility that whatever was affecting him might spread to the rest of us. We needed to either get rescued soon or find a way to reach safety on our own. The problem was that all the traditional escape routes were compromised. The hospital was surrounded by infected people, the roads were impassable, and the authorities who might have helped us were either overwhelmed or had withdrawn to more defensible positions. But I'd learned something important during my final deployment in Syria when my unit had been cut off behind enemy lines for 18 hours. Sometimes the best way out of an impossible situation is to stop thinking about it as impossible and start thinking about it as a complex problem with an unconventional solution. I started thinking about my boat at the marina in San Diego, about the sailing lessons I'd been giving to kids from the community center. Those kids had learned basic seamanship, how to handle a boat in different weather conditions, how to navigate using landmarks and compass headings. More importantly, they'd learned to think of water as safety, as a barrier that could protect them from land-based threats. If I could get to San Diego, if I could reach the marina, I'd have access to a mobile platform that could keep me safe while I figured out what to do next. But San Diego was 300 miles away, and getting there would mean crossing a landscape that was increasingly hostile. I'd need supplies, transportation, and a route that avoided the major population centers where this infection seemed to be spreading fastest. It was a long shot, but it was better than staying on the roof waiting for a rescue that might never come. I was starting to explain this plan to the others when Tony collapsed. He'd been sitting on an air conditioning unit, looking pale and sweaty, when suddenly his eyes rolled back and he fell backward onto the roof. Sarah immediately went to help him, checking his pulse and breathing, but when she touched his skin, she pulled her hand back quickly. She said his body temperature was dropping rapidly, which didn't make sense given that he'd been running a fever just minutes before. We all gathered around Tony, trying to figure out what was happening to him. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his skin was turning an even deeper shade of gray, and the wound on his hand was now obviously infected with something. Didn't look like any normal bacterial infection. Kim suggested we try to get him to a hospital, but Pete pointed out that we were already at a hospital, and it was full of people who were trying to kill us. That's when I made a decision that still haunts me. I told everyone to step back from Tony, to give him space and not touch him until we figured out what was happening. I'd seen too many good people die in combat because they'd tried to help wounded comrades without taking proper precautions. Whatever was affecting Tony might be contagious, and we couldn't risk losing more people. Sarah argued with me, said that Tony was a human being who deserved medical attention regardless of the risk. She was right, morally speaking, but I'd learned in Syria that moral choices and survival choices don't always align. Sometimes you have to make decisions that feel wrong in order to keep more people alive. I told Sarah that if she wanted to help Tony, she could do it from a safe distance, but nobody was going to get close enough to be infected if he was carrying whatever had turned the people in the hospital into predators. For about 10 minutes, Tony lay unconscious on the roof while we watched from several feet away. His breathing became even more irregular, then seemed to stop completely. Sarah checked for a pulse from as far away as she could reach and announced that he was gone. We all stood there in silence, processing the fact that we'd just watched a good man die from some kind of infection we didn't understand. Then Tony opened his eyes. But they weren't Tony's eyes anymore. They had the same empty, predatory look I'd seen in Mrs. Henderson and the others. Tony sat up with a motion that was too quick and too fluid for someone who had just been unconscious. He turned his head toward us, and I could see that whatever had made him human was gone, replaced by something that saw us as prey. Tony stood up and started moving toward Sarah, who was closest to him. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, but there was purpose behind them. He wasn't confused or disoriented like someone waking up from unconsciousness. He was hunting. I didn't have time to think about what I was doing. My combat training took over, and I tackled Tony before he could reach Sarah. We both went down hard on the roof, and I could feel immediately that his body was wrong. His skin was cold and clammy. His muscles were rigid in ways that didn't match normal human physiology, and he was stronger than he should have been for someone who had just been dying. But what really convinced me that Tony was gone was his reaction to pain. I was trying to pin him down, using joint locks and pressure points that would have incapacitated any normal person. Tony didn't react at all. He kept trying to bite me, snapping his teeth toward my face and arms with animal-like persistence. I'd restrained combative people before, both in military and civilian contexts, but Tony wasn't fighting like a person. He was attacking like a predator that had been programmed to kill. The others were shouting at me to let him go, to stop hurting him, but I knew that what I was holding down wasn't Tony anymore. It was something else wearing Tony's body, and if I let it go, it would try to kill all of us. I managed to wrestle it toward the edge of the roof, toward the side that overlooked the hospital's rear parking area. I told the others to stay back, that this wasn't Tony anymore, that whatever had infected him had taken away everything that made him human. I pushed what had been Tony off the roof. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, not because of the physical effort, but because part of me still saw him as the maintenance worker who had helped us reach safety the day before. But I'd learned in Syria that hesitation gets people killed, and I wasn't going to let sentiment cost the lives of the people who were still human. The thing that had been Tony hit the pavement 4 stories below, and I expected that to be the end of it. But when I looked over the edge, it was already getting back up. Its body was obviously damaged from the fall. One arm bent at an unnatural angle, but it was moving again, looking up at us with those same empty, hunting eyes. That's when I understood what we were really dealing with. This wasn't a disease that made people violent or crazy. This was something that killed people and then reanimated their bodies, turning them into predators that hunted living humans. The people we'd seen in the hospital corridors, the groups wandering through the city streets, they were all dead. They were corpses being controlled by whatever infection had killed them. I explained this to the others, and I could see the disbelief in their faces. Sarah said I was wrong, that there had to be a medical explanation for what we'd witnessed. Kim suggested that maybe Tony had been in some kind of coma or vegetative state rather than actually dead. Pete just stared at me like I'd lost my mind. But I'd seen enough combat to recognize the difference between a wounded person and a dead one. I'd seen what human bodies look like when they're pushed beyond their limits, and I'd seen what they look like when life leaves them. Tony had been dead, and something had brought his body back to a semblance of life for the sole purpose of hunting and killing other people. Over the next few hours, we watched the city continue to deteriorate. The scattered groups of infected people we'd seen in the morning were now forming larger crowds, moving through the streets with what appeared to be coordinated purpose. Emergency services had completely broken down. The radio was now mostly static, with only occasional automated broadcasts repeating evacuation instructions for areas that were probably already overrun. Around noon, we witnessed something that confirmed my theory about what was happening. A news helicopter appeared over the city, probably trying to get footage of the crisis for a television station. We could see it circling different areas, maintaining a safe altitude as it documented the chaos below. But something went wrong, and the helicopter started losing altitude, eventually crashing into an office building about 2 miles from the hospital. Within minutes, we could see people running away from the crash site. But we could also see infected people moving toward it, drawn by the noise and commotion. Through the binoculars, we watched what happened next. The survivors of the crash were trying to escape the building, but they were being chased by infected people who had been drawn to the area. Some of the survivors made it to the street, but others didn't. And then, over the next hour, we saw some of the people who had been killed in the crash begin to move again. They got up from where they had fallen and started moving with the same jerky, predatory gait as the others. The infection, whatever it was, could spread through bites or direct contact, and it reanimated the dead within a relatively short period of time. This changed everything about our tactical situation. We weren't just dealing with sick people who could be helped or hostile people who could be reasoned with. We were facing an enemy that was already dead, that felt no pain, that couldn't be negotiated with or deterred by conventional means. Every person who got killed by these things would become one of them, exponentially, increasing their numbers while decreasing ours. I started planning our escape from the hospital with this new information in mind. The infected people were attracted to noise and movement, which meant we needed to be quiet and avoid areas where they were concentrated. They seemed to have limited problem-solving abilities, which meant we might be able to use obstacles and barriers that would stop them, but not us. Most importantly, they appeared to be strongest in numbers, which meant our best chance was to avoid them entirely rather than trying to fight our way through groups of them. The plan when developed was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. We would wait until after dark, when visibility was limited and the infected might be less active. We would make our way down from the roof using the fire escape on the hospital's east side, which overlooked a smaller parking area that seemed to have fewer infected people. From there, we would try to reach the residential area behind the hospital, where we could find transportation and supplies for a longer journey. My ultimate goal was still to reach the marina in San Diego, but I realized that the others might not want to make such a long and dangerous trip. Sarah had family in Phoenix and wanted to try to find them. Kim was worried about her elderly parents who lived in a retirement community on the other side of the city. Pete was single and had no strong ties to the area, so he was more open to the idea of leaving entirely. I told them that we needed to stick together at least until we got away from the hospital and found somewhere safer to plan our next moves. Group survival was always more effective than individual survival, especially when facing an unknown threat. We could pool our resources, watch each other's backs, and make better decisions as a team than any of us could make alone. As the afternoon wore on, we started preparing for our escape attempt. We gathered everything useful we could find on the roof, including Tony's maintenance tools, some basic first aid supplies from an emergency kit, and a few bottles of water from a vending machine that Pete had managed to break open. We also tore up some clothing to make improvised bandages and noise dampeners for our shoes. I spent time teaching the others some basic movement techniques I'd learned in the military. How to walk quietly, how to stay low and use cover, how to communicate without speaking. They were all intelligent people, and they picked up the basics quickly. But I knew that knowing something intellectually and being able to do it under pressure were two very different things. Around 4 in the afternoon, we saw something that made me reconsider our escape timeline. Military vehicles appeared on the horizon, not the scattered fleeing convoy we'd seen earlier, but a proper formation moving with purpose through the city. There were helicopters providing air support, and we could see what looked like coordinated operations taking place in several locations. For a moment, I thought maybe the military was regaining control of the situation, that help was finally coming. But as we watched through the binoculars, it became clear that this wasn't a rescue operation. The military units were establishing a perimeter around the entire city, positioning themselves to contain whatever was happening rather than to stop it. They were quarantining Phoenix, cutting off all escape routes, and trapping everyone inside. With the infected, this changed our situation dramatically. If the military was containing the city, that meant they had decided that Phoenix was a loss, that everyone inside was either infected or expendable. It meant that no help was coming, that we were truly on our own, and that our window for escape was closing rapidly. I made the decision to move our escape attempt up to early evening rather than waiting for full darkness. If the military was establishing a quarantine perimeter, we needed to get out of the city before that perimeter was complete. Once they had us surrounded, our chances of reaching safety would drop to nearly zero. I explained the situation to the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes as they realized what this meant. We weren't just trying to escape from infected people anymore. We were trying to escape from a quarantine zone that our own government had written off as hopeless. We had maybe a few hours to get out of Phoenix before we were trapped inside with thousands of infected people and no way to call for help. As the sun started to set, we made our final preparations for what would either be our escape to safety or our last few hours of life. I checked everyone's gear one more time, reviewed our route through the hospital and into the residential area beyond, and tried to prepare them mentally for what we were about to face. But before we left the roof, I took one last look at the city that had been our home, now transformed into something from a nightmare. The lights were going out in sections, smoke was rising from dozens of fires, and the streets were full of figures moving in the growing darkness. Whatever happened next, Phoenix as we knew it was gone forever, and we were about to enter a world where the dead walked among the living, hunting for fresh victims to join their ranks. We started our descent from the hospital roof just as the sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me too much of the fires burning across Phoenix. I'd chosen the east fire escape, because it overlooked a smaller parking area that seemed to have fewer infected people. But as we made our way down the metal stairs, I could see that our intelligence was already outdated. What had been a relatively clear area that morning was now populated with at least a dozen figures wandering aimlessly between the abandoned cars. The fire escape creaked under our weight, and every sound seemed amplified in the evening air. I positioned myself at the front of our group, with Sarah behind me, then Kim and Pete bringing up the rear. We moved slowly, testing each step, before putting our full weight on it, stopping frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate we'd been detected by the infected below. About halfway down, we encountered our first real problem. One of the infected people, a man in a business suit who had probably been visiting someone in the hospital when the outbreak started, had somehow made his way onto the fire escape platform 2 floors below us. He was facing away from us, staring out at the parking lot with that vacant but alert expression I'd come to associate with the infected. His presence blocked our path, and there was no way around him on the narrow metal platform. I signaled for the others to stop and wait while I figured out how to handle this. In my SEAL training, we'd learned that sometimes the best way to deal with a sentry was to eliminate them quietly rather than trying to sneak past. But this wasn't a human sentry who might fall asleep or get distracted. This was something that seemed to operate on pure predatory instinct, and I had no idea how sensitive its hearing or other senses might be. I decided to test a theory that had been forming in my mind about how these things detected their prey. Moving very slowly, I picked up a small piece of debris from the fire escape and threw it toward the far side of the parking lot. The infected man immediately turned toward the sound, then began moving in that direction with the same jerky but purposeful gait I'd observed before. This confirmed that they were primarily attracted to noise and movement, which meant we might be able to use misdirection to avoid direct confrontation. We waited until the infected man had climbed down from the fire escape and was investigating the area where I'd thrown the debris. Then we quickly but quietly made our way past his former position and continued toward the ground level. The strategy worked, but it also taught me something important about the tactical situation we were facing. These things weren't just mindless zombies wandering around randomly. They were actively hunting, responding to stimuli, and capable of basic problem solving like climbing stairs and navigating obstacles. When we reached the bottom of the fire escape, we found ourselves in a narrow alley between the hospital and a medical office building. The alley was darker than the parking areas, which provided concealment but also limited our visibility. I could hear infected people moving around nearby, but I couldn't see exactly where they were or how many we might be dealing with. This was exactly the kind of situation where my combat experience became crucial, because I'd learned to operate effectively in low-visibility environments where the enemy could be anywhere. I gathered the group close and explained our next move in whispers. We needed to cross the parking area and reach the residential streets beyond, but we'd have to do it without attracting the attention of the infected people scattered throughout the area. I assigned each person a specific route and told them to move independently but maintain visual contact with each other. If anyone got separated or ran into trouble, they were to make noise to distract the infected while the others escaped. Sarah asked me what would happen if one of us got bitten during the crossing, and I gave her the honest answer. Based on what we'd seen with Tony, a bite seemed to be fatal within a matter of hours, followed by reanimation as one of the infected. If someone got bitten, they would need to be isolated from the group immediately. Not just for our safety, but to give them a chance to say goodbye while they were still human. It was a harsh reality, but one we all needed to understand before we put ourselves at risk. We began moving across the parking lot using the technique I'd learned in urban warfare training. Instead of moving as a group, we spread out and used the abandoned cars as cover, moving from vehicle to vehicle while maintaining sight lines with each other. The infected people in the area were scattered enough that we could avoid most of them, but there were a few close calls where we had to freeze in place while one of them wandered past our hiding spots. About halfway across the parking lot, Kim made a mistake that almost cost us everything. She was moving between two cars when she stepped on a piece of broken glass that crunched loudly under her foot. The sound immediately attracted the attention of 3 infected people who had been wandering near the hospital entrance. They turned toward our area and began moving in our direction with that focused predatory intent that meant they detected prey. I had to make a split-second decision. We could try to hide and hope they lost interest, or we could create a distraction to draw them away from our position. I chose the distraction option, throwing a larger piece of debris toward the opposite side of the parking lot. 2 of the infected people followed the sound, but the third one kept coming toward us, apparently having pinpointed our location more precisely. This infected person had been a hospital security guard, still wearing the same uniform I'd seen on my colleagues just 2 days earlier. The sight of someone I might have worked alongside now hunting me like an animal was deeply disturbing. But I couldn't let emotional reactions compromise our survival. I positioned myself between the infected guard and the rest of my group, preparing to fight if necessary, while hoping we could still avoid direct confrontation. The infected guard moved closer, tilting his head like he was listening for additional sounds that might reveal our exact position. He was maybe 20 feet away when Pete, who was hiding behind a car to my left, accidentally knocked over a bottle that someone had left on the ground. The infected guard immediately locked onto the sound and started moving toward Pete's position. I made another quick decision based on tactical priorities. Pete was military trained and might be able to handle himself in a confrontation, while Sarah and Kim were civilians who would be more vulnerable if we got scattered. I moved to intercept the infected guard before he could reach Pete, using a technique I'd learned for dealing with combative individuals in close quarters. The key to fighting infected people, I quickly learned, was understanding that normal pain compliance techniques didn't work. The infected guard didn't respond to joint locks or pressure points the way a living person would. He felt no pain, showed no fear, and had only one objective, which was to bite me and spread whatever infection had killed him. But he also retained the basic motor functions and muscle memory of his human body, which meant I could use his own momentum and reflexes against him. I managed to trip him using a basic leg sweep, sending him to the ground hard enough that he was temporarily disoriented. That gave me time to grab a tire iron from one of the abandoned cars and use it to keep distance between us while I figured out my next move. The infected guard got back up almost immediately, showing that same unnatural resilience I'd observed when I'd pushed Tony off the roof. But something interesting happened during this confrontation. The noise of our struggle attracted other infected people from around the parking lot. Instead of just the 3 we'd initially been trying to avoid, we now had 6 or 7 of them, converging on our position. They weren't coordinating their approach in any sophisticated way, but they were all responding to the same stimulus and moving toward the same target. This told me that infected people could inadvertently work together, simply by following their basic hunting instincts. I realized we needed to get out of the parking lot immediately before we were completely surrounded. I called out to the others to move toward the residential area as quickly as possible while I dealt with the infected people who were focused on me. This was a calculated risk, because splitting up made us more vulnerable individually, but staying together would have meant fighting our way through an ever-increasing number of infected people. Sarah, Kim, and Pete made it to the edge of the parking lot, while I used the tire iron to keep the infected people at bay. I'd learned from my brief fight with the infected guard that head trauma seemed to be the most effective way to stop them, probably because it disrupted whatever neurological processes were animating their bodies. But getting close enough to deliver effective head strikes meant putting myself within biting range, which was extremely dangerous given what we'd learned about how the infection spread. I managed to disable 2 of the infected people using the tire iron, but the others were closing in, and I was running out of room to maneuver. That's when I remembered something from my demolitions training about using environmental advantages to multiply your effectiveness. The parking lot was full of abandoned cars, some of which still had their engines running, probably because their drivers had fled in panic when the outbreak started. I led the pursuing infected people toward one of these running vehicles, a pickup truck that had been left with its driver's door open. I managed to get behind the truck and then pushed it forward, using its momentum to knock down several infected people at once. The truck rolled slowly across the parking lot, giving me time to escape while the infected people tried to figure out what had happened. This experience taught me something crucial about fighting the infected. Individual combat was possible, but extremely risky, and the noise of fighting would always attract more of them. The better strategy was to use environmental advantages, misdirection, and mobility to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. These things were relentless, but not particularly intelligent, which meant they could be outmaneuvered by someone who understood their limitations. I caught up with the others at the edge of a residential neighborhood behind the hospital. They were hiding behind a concrete wall that separated the medical complex from a subdivision of single-family homes. Sarah had a minor cut on her arm from climbing over some debris, but otherwise everyone was in good condition. More importantly, we'd successfully escaped from the hospital without losing anyone, and we'd learned valuable information about how to deal with infected people. The residential area presented both opportunities and challenges. The houses might contain supplies we needed, including food, water, weapons, and potentially vehicles we could use for transportation. But they might also contain infected residents who had been trapped inside when the outbreak started. We'd need to search carefully and systematically, clearing each house before entering and always maintaining escape routes in case we encountered more infected people than we could handle. I decided our first priority should be finding a secure base of operations where we could rest, plan our next moves, and treat Sarah's cut properly. I was looking for a house that was isolated from its neighbors, had good sight lines in all directions, and showed no signs of current occupation by either living or infected residents. After surveying several possibilities, I identified a 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac that met all our criteria. The house appeared to be empty, with no cars in the driveway and no lights visible through the windows. More importantly, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle that might indicate infected people were inside. I approached the front door while the others waited at a safe distance, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate the presence of infected residents. The front door was unlocked, which could have been either a good sign or a bad sign, depending on why the residents had left it that way. I entered slowly, using techniques I'd learned for clearing buildings in hostile territory. The ground floor appeared to be empty, with signs that the residents had left quickly but not in panic. Dishes were still on the kitchen table, but personal. Items like wallets and keys were gone, suggesting the family had evacuated voluntarily rather than fleeing from immediate danger. I called the others inside after determining that the ground floor was secure, and we began a systematic search of the entire house. The second floor was also empty, but we found something in the master bedroom that gave us important information about what had happened to the residents. There was a note on the dresser explaining that the family had gone to stay with relatives in another state when they heard about the trouble in Phoenix. They'd left the house unlocked in case neighbors needed a place to take shelter. This was exactly the kind of break we needed. The house was fully stocked with food and water, had a generator in the garage that could provide power if the electrical grid failed completely, and contained several items that could be useful for self-defense. Most importantly, it was located in an area that seemed to have fewer infected people than the hospital district, giving us time to plan our next moves without constant pressure. We spent the first hour in the house taking inventory of available supplies and planning our immediate needs. Sarah treated her cut with first aid supplies from the bathroom medicine cabinet. Kim found a battery-powered radio that was still picking up emergency broadcasts from outside the quarantine zone. Pete located several potential weapons in the garage, including a baseball bat, a machete that the homeowner had apparently used for yard work, and a small toolbox that contained items we could use for basic repairs. But the most important discovery was in the home office, where we found detailed street maps of Phoenix and the surrounding area. I spread these maps out on the dining room table and began planning potential escape routes from the city. The military quarantine perimeter was tightening, but based on the radio broadcasts Kim was monitoring, it wasn't completely sealed yet. There might still be gaps we could exploit if we moved quickly and chose our route carefully. I showed the others my intended destination, the marina in San Diego, where I kept my boat. It was a long journey under normal circumstances, nearly 300 miles through desert and mountain terrain. Under current conditions, with infected people scattered throughout the population centers and military units trying to contain the outbreak, it would be exponentially more dangerous. But I also explained why the marina represented our best chance for long-term survival. Boats provided mobility and isolation that land-based shelters couldn't match. The infected people seemed to be land-based predators with no apparent ability to swim, operate watercraft. If we could reach the ocean, we could establish a floating base of operations that would be virtually impregnable against this particular threat. Sarah expressed doubts about leaving Phoenix, arguing that her family might still be alive somewhere in the city, and that we had a responsibility to try to find other survivors. Kim was worried about the dangers of traveling such a long distance, through potentially hostile territory with limited supplies, and no guarantee that the marina would actually be safe when we arrived. I understood their concerns, but I also knew from my military experience that rescue fantasies could be more dangerous than the actual threats you were facing. The longer we stayed in Phoenix, the more likely it became that we'd encounter infected people in numbers we couldn't handle, or that the military quarantine would become so tight that escape would be impossible. We had a narrow window of opportunity to get out of the city, and that window was closing rapidly. Pete supported my assessment, pointing out that we'd already seen how quickly the situation in Phoenix had deteriorated. The infrastructure was collapsing, emergency services had been overwhelmed, and the military was treating the entire city as a contaminated zone. Staying meant gambling that conditions would improve, while leaving meant accepting known risks for the possibility of reaching genuine safety. We spent another hour debating our options before Kim's radio monitoring resolved the question for U.S. She picked up a military transmission indicating that the quarantine perimeter would be complete by dawn, with orders to prevent any movement in or out of the designated zone. After that point, anyone found inside the perimeter would be considered potentially infected and subject to immediate termination. This changed our timeline dramatically. We had maybe 6 hours to get out of Phoenix before the military sealed us inside with thousands of infected people and no hope of rescue. I told the group that anyone who wanted to stay was welcome to remain in the house, but I was leaving for San Diego as soon as I could gather the necessary supplies for the journey. To my surprise, all 3 of them decided to come with me. Sarah said she'd realized that her family had probably evacuated the city like the residents of our current house, and that her best chance of reuniting with them was to survive long enough to search for them later. Kim admitted that her parents' retirement community was in an area that had gone dark on the radio, suggesting it had already been overrun. Pete simply said he trusted my judgment and didn't want to face the infected people alone. We spent the next 2 hours preparing for what would be the most dangerous part of our escape attempt. I selected a route that would take us through the least populated areas between Phoenix and the city limits, using back roads and avoiding the major highways where military checkpoints were most likely to be established. We gathered supplies for a 3-day journey, including food, water, basic medical supplies, and the improvised weapons we'd found in the house. Most importantly, I found something in the garage that would significantly improve our chances of reaching San Diego alive. The homeowner had been an outdoor enthusiast, and his garage contained camping gear that included detailed topographical maps of the entire southwestern region. These maps showed terrain features, water sources, and remote roads that didn't appear on standard street maps. With this information, I could plan a route that would keep us away from population centers where infected people were most likely to be concentrated. As we prepared to leave the house that had provided us with temporary safety, I could see the fear in my companions' faces. They understood that we were about to enter the most dangerous phase of our escape attempt, traveling through unknown territory where infected people might be waiting around any corner. But I also saw determination, the kind of resolve that comes when people realize they have no choice but to move forward into uncertainty. I told them one last time about the importance of staying together, following my lead, and remembering everything they'd learned about moving quietly and avoiding detection. We were about to leave the relative safety of our temporary shelter and venture into a landscape where making the wrong decision could mean death or something worse. But we were also moving toward the possibility of genuine safety, toward a place where we could survive whatever came next, and maybe even help other people who were facing the same nightmare we'd been living through. As we stepped out into the night air, I looked back at the house that had given us time to rest and plan. In a few hours, it would be inside a military quarantine zone, cut off from the outside world and surrounded by an enemy that never tired, never gave up, and never stopped hunting for fresh victims to add to their ranks. We left the house just after 10 at night, moving through the residential streets with the kind of tactical spacing I'd learned during urban warfare training in Iraq. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, but not the peaceful quiet you'd expect from a suburban area after dark. This was the silence of a place where people had either fled or been killed, punctuated occasionally by distant sounds that reminded us we weren't alone out there. Our first objective was to reach the edge of the residential district without attracting attention from any infected people who might be wandering through the area. I'd chosen a route that kept us away from the main streets, using alleys and backyard passages to maintain concealment. The others followed behind me at 15-foot intervals, close enough to maintain visual contact, but spread out enough that a single infected person couldn't catch all of us at once. About 6 blocks from our starting point, we encountered our first real test of how well we could work together under pressure. As we were crossing a small park that connected 2 residential streets, Sarah spotted movement near the playground equipment. 3 infected people were wandering around the swing sets, probably former residents of the neighborhood, who had been infected during the early stages of the outbreak and had been wandering aimlessly ever since. I signaled for everyone to freeze while I assessed the situation. The infected people hadn't noticed us yet, but our planned route would take us directly through their patrol area. We could backtrack and find an alternate route, but that would cost us time we couldn't afford. Given our deadline for getting out of the city before the military sealed the quarantine perimeter, we could try to sneak past them, but the park offered very little cover, and the infected people seemed to be moving in patterns that would bring them close to any route we might take. I made the decision to create a distraction that would draw them away from our path. Using a technique I'd learned for dealing with enemy patrols, I picked up several rocks and threw them toward the far side of the park, creating a series of impacts that sounded like someone moving through the area. The infected people immediately responded to the noise, shambling toward the sound with that focused intensity that told me they'd detected what they thought was prey. While they were investigating the distraction, we moved quickly but quietly across the park, staying low and using the playground equipment to break up our silhouettes. The strategy worked perfectly, and we made it to the other side without being detected. But the experience reinforced something important about the tactical situation we were facing. These infected people might not be intelligent in any conventional sense, but they were persistent hunters who would investigate any sign of potential prey. As we continued through the residential area, I started noticing patterns in how the infected people moved and behaved. They seemed to be more active in areas where there had been recent human activity, suggesting they could detect scents or other traces that living people left behind. They also appeared to be attracted to areas with artificial lighting, possibly because they associated light with human presence. This information was crucial for planning our route through the city, because it meant we needed to avoid not just populated areas, but also places that looked like they might still be inhabited. Around midnight, we reached the edge of the residential district and found ourselves facing a much more challenging obstacle. Between us and the industrial area that would lead to the city limits was a major arterial road, 4 lanes of asphalt that offered no cover and was brightly lit by streetlights that were still functioning. Worse, the road was scattered with abandoned vehicles, some of which had their doors open and their emergency flashers still blinking, creating a chaotic pattern of light and shadow that would make it difficult to spot threats until we were very close to them. I spent 20 minutes observing the road from our concealed position, watching for any signs of infected people or military patrols that might be monitoring the area. What I saw was both encouraging and terrifying. There were no obvious military checkpoints, which suggested we might still be ahead of the quarantine perimeter. But there were definitely infected people moving among the abandoned cars at least. A dozen that I could see, possibly more hidden in the shadows between vehicles. The infected people on the road were behaving differently than the ones we'd encountered in the residential areas. Instead of wandering aimlessly, they seemed to be drawn to the abandoned cars, investigating each one as if they were looking for something specific. It took me a while to figure out what was attracting them, but then I realized they were probably responding to scents left behind by the people who had abandoned the vehicles. Some of those cars might even still contain bodies of people who had been killed during the initial panic. I explained the situation to the others and outlined our options. We could try to cross the road directly, using the abandoned cars as cover, but risking encounters with the infected people who were already in the area. We could follow the road until we found a section with fewer obstacles and threats, but that would take us farther from our planned route and consume time we couldn't afford. Or we could find an alternate route that avoided the road entirely, but that might take us into areas we hadn't scouted and where we'd be operating blind. Pete suggested we try to find a way around the road entirely, arguing that the risks of crossing it were too high given how many infected people were in the area. Kim agreed, saying she'd rather face unknown dangers than walk into a situation where we could already see multiple threats. But Sarah pointed out that any alternate route would probably involve similar challenges, and that we'd already confirmed our planned route was the most direct path to safety. I made the decision based on military doctrine about acceptable risk versus mission requirements. Crossing the road was dangerous, but it was a known danger that we could plan for and mitigate. Taking an alternate route was potentially even more dangerous because we'd be operating without intelligence about what we might encounter. More importantly, we were racing against a deadline, and every detour increased the chances that we'd still be inside the city when the military completed their quarantine perimeter. The crossing strategy I developed was based on techniques I'd learned from moving through areas with multiple hostile contacts. Instead of trying to avoid all the infected people, we would create a coordinated distraction that would draw them to one end of our crossing zone, then move quickly through the area they'd vacated. The key was timing and discipline, making sure everyone understood their role and executed it precisely. I positioned Sarah and Kim at our starting point with instructions to throw rocks toward the south end, of the road exactly 2 minutes after Pete and I began moving toward the north end. The noise would attract the infected people toward the distraction area, giving Sarah and Kim a clear path to cross while Pete and I dealt with any stragglers who didn't take the bait. Once everyone was across, we'd regroup and continue toward the industrial district. The plan worked almost perfectly. The infected people responded to the distraction exactly as I'd predicted, shambling toward the noise with single-minded focus. Pete and I made it across the road without encountering any resistance, and Sarah and Kim followed 30 seconds later using the path we'd cleared. But as we were regrouping on the far side, something happened that reminded me how quickly situations could change when dealing with an unpredictable enemy. One of the abandoned cars in the middle of the road suddenly erupted with activity. A car door that had been closed swung open, and 2 infected people emerged from the vehicle where they'd apparently been trapped since the initial outbreak. They immediately detected our presence and began moving toward us with that same focused intensity we'd learned to fear. Worse, their movement attracted the attention of the infected people who had been investigating the distraction, and suddenly we had multiple threats converging on our position. I had to make another split-second tactical decision. We could try to fight our way out, but that would create noise that might attract even more infected people from the surrounding area. We could try to run, but Sarah and Kim were civilians who might not be able to maintain the pace needed to outrun pursuers. Or we could find a defensive position and wait for the immediate threat to pass, but that would cost us precious time and might leave us trapped if more infected people arrived. I chose a combination approach that drew on my experience with asymmetric warfare. Pete and I would engage the nearest threats to buy time for Sarah and Kim to reach a defensive position. Then we'd join them and reassess the situation. The key was to end the engagement quickly and quietly, before it could escalate into a running battle that would attract infected people from across the entire district. The close-quarters combat techniques I'd learned as a SEAL were effective against infected people, but I had to modify them significantly to account for their unique characteristics. Normal pain compliance methods didn't work because they felt no pain. Restraint techniques were dangerous because any prolonged contact increased the risk of being bitten. The most effective approach was to use their own momentum against them, redirecting their attacks and using environmental advantages to disable them quickly. I managed to take down one of the infected people by using its own charging momentum to drive it into the concrete barrier that separated the road from a drainage ditch. The impact was severe enough to cause significant damage to its motor functions, effectively removing it as a threat without requiring prolonged combat. Pete used a similar technique on another infected person, tripping it into a pile of debris that trapped it temporarily. But the engagement attracted exactly the kind of attention I'd been trying to avoid. More infected people began emerging from hiding spots among the abandoned cars, and I could hear others approaching from the residential areas we'd just left. We were in danger of being surrounded by numbers we couldn't handle, and our window for escape was closing rapidly. I called for immediate withdrawal to a more defensible position. There was an overpass about 200 yards ahead that would give us elevation advantage and limit the directions from which we could be attacked. We moved toward it as quickly as possible while maintaining enough tactical discipline to avoid running into additional threats. Sarah and Kim kept pace better than I'd expected, probably motivated by the realization that falling behind could mean death. We reached the overpass just as the first wave of infected people arrived at our former position. From our elevated vantage point, I could see exactly how many we were dealing with, and the number was sobering. At least 20 infected people were now converging on the area where we'd crossed the road, drawn by the noise of our brief combat engagement. If we'd tried to fight our way through all of them, we would have been overwhelmed within minutes. But the overpass position also gave me a clear view of our next challenge. The industrial district that lay between us and the city limits was not the empty wasteland I'd hoped for. There were lights moving through the area, not the random wandering of infected people, but the organized patterns of vehicle patrols. The military quarantine operation was ahead of schedule, and they were already beginning to seal off potential escape routes. I studied the patrol patterns through the binoculars we'd taken from the house, trying to identify gaps we could exploit. The military units seemed to be focusing on the major roads and obvious choke points, but they hadn't yet established a complete perimeter. There were still unmonitored areas where we might be able to slip through, but only if we moved immediately and chose our route carefully. The challenge was that reaching those unmonitored areas would require crossing several miles of industrial terrain that offered little cover and concealment. Factories, warehouses, and storage facilities provided some opportunities for hiding, but they might also contain infected workers who had been trapped inside when the outbreak started. We'd be trading the known threats behind us for unknown dangers ahead, with no guarantee that we'd find a way through the military perimeter, even if we managed to avoid the infected people. I explained the situation to the others, and I could see the exhaustion and fear in their faces. We'd been moving for hours, fighting for our lives multiple times, and pushing our physical and emotional limits to reach this point. The prospect of crossing several more miles of dangerous terrain before dawn was daunting, especially since we had no guarantee that safety lay on the other side. But I also reminded them of what we'd accomplished so far. We'd escaped from a hospital that was overrun with infected people, found shelter and supplies in a hostile environment, and crossed miles of urban terrain without losing anyone from our group. We'd learned how to work together as a team, how to deal with the infected people we encountered, and how to make tactical decisions under pressure. Most importantly, we'd maintained our humanity and our determination to survive in a world that had suddenly become a nightmare. Kim asked me what would happen if we couldn't find a way through the military perimeter, if we ended up trapped inside the quarantine zone with no hope of escape. I gave her the most honest answer I could. If we couldn't get out of Phoenix, we'd have to find a way to survive inside the quarantine zone until either the military situation changed or the infection burned itself out. It wouldn't be easy, but we'd already proven we could adapt to circumstances that would have killed most people. Sarah wanted to know if I really believed we could make it to San Diego, if the marina I'd described would actually provide the safety I'd promised. I told her that I couldn't guarantee anything, except that staying in Phoenix would eventually get us killed, while heading for the marina at least offered the possibility of long-term survival. The ocean represented isolation from land-based threats, mobility that would allow us to avoid concentrations of infected people, and access to resources that might not be available in terrestrial environments. Pete asked the most practical question of all. What was our immediate next move, given the military patrols we could see in the industrial district and the infected people who were still searching for us behind the overpass? I studied the terrain ahead one more time, looking for opportunities I might have missed, trying to find a route that would get us through the industrial area without being detected by either the military or any infected people who might be in the area. That's when I spotted something that changed our entire approach to the problem. About half a mile into the industrial district, there was a canal that carried runoff from the mountains toward the Salt River. The canal was concrete-lined and probably 10 feet deep, creating a depression in the landscape that would provide concealment from surface observers while still allowing us to move in the right direction. More importantly, the canal appeared to pass under the major roads rather than crossing them at grade level, which meant we might be able to use it to bypass the military checkpoints entirely. I pointed out the canal to the others and explained how we could use it as a concealed route through the industrial district. The terrain would be more difficult because we'd be moving through an artificial drainage system, but the concealment advantages were significant. We'd be invisible to patrols unless they specifically searched the canal, and we'd avoid most of the areas where infected people were likely to be concentrated. The plan had risks, of course. Canals could become death traps if we encountered infected people while we were in them, because the concrete walls would limit our escape options. Flash flooding was also a possibility if there was any rainfall in the mountains, though the weather forecast had been clear when we'd last heard radio reports. Most concerning was that we'd have no way of knowing what conditions were like ahead of us until we were committed to the route. But the canal route offered our best chance of reaching the edge of Phoenix before the military completed their quarantine perimeter. It would take us directly toward the desert areas where we'd have the best opportunities for avoiding both infected people and military patrols during the final phase of our escape. Most importantly, it would allow us to maintain the initiative rather than reacting to threats as we encountered them. We climbed down from the overpass and began making our way toward the canal, moving carefully through the edges of the industrial district while avoiding the areas where military patrols were most active. The infected people who had been searching for us near the road seemed to have lost our trail, probably because we'd gained enough distance and elevation to break the scent trail they'd been following. As we approached the canal, I could see that my assessment from the overpass had been mostly accurate. The concrete channel was deep enough to provide concealment and appeared to extend in the right direction for our purposes. But there were also signs that other people had been using it for shelter, probably refugees from the early stages of the outbreak who had been looking for safe places to hide. Some of those refugees might still be alive, hiding in the drainage tunnels and maintenance areas that connected to the main canal. But others had probably been infected, either before they reached the canal or by other infected people who had followed them into what they thought was a safe refuge. We'd need to clear each section of the canal before moving through it, treating every tunnel entrance and blind corner as a potential ambush site. I led the group down into the canal, using techniques I'd learned for clearing confined spaces. In hostile territory, the concrete walls amplified every sound, so we had to move even more quietly than we had on the surface. But the canal also channeled sound in predictable ways, which meant I could use audio cues to detect threats that might be waiting ahead of us. As we began moving through the canal system toward what I hoped would be our escape route from Phoenix, I reflected on how much had changed since I'd first arrived at the hospital just 3 days earlier. We'd gone from being ordinary people living normal lives to being refugees fleeing through a quarantine zone, fighting for survival against an enemy that had once been our neighbors, friends, and colleagues. But we were still alive, still human, and still moving toward safety. The canal stretched ahead of us into the darkness, carrying us away from the city that had become a tomb and toward the unknown dangers that lay between us and the ocean. Whatever happened next, we'd face it together, using everything we'd learned about survival, teamwork, and the terrible new realities of a world where the dead walked among the living. The canal carried us through the industrial district for almost 2 miles, and with each step I took through that concrete channel, I felt the weight of my final mission in Syria pressing against my mind. The coordinates tattooed on my left wrist, which commemorated the location where I'd lost half my SEAL team, were becoming more than just a memorial. In the darkness of the canal, with infected people somewhere above us and military patrols blocking our escape routes, those numbers were guiding my navigation, just like they had during the 18 hours my unit spent cut off behind enemy lines. The similarities between Syria and Phoenix were unsettling. The same feeling of being surrounded by hostile forces, the same need to move through enemy territory using concealed routes, the same constant awareness that making the wrong decision could get everyone killed. But there was one crucial difference. In Syria, we'd been fighting other human beings who could be reasoned with, intimidated, or outmaneuvered using conventional tactics. The infected people hunting us through Phoenix operated on pure predatory instinct, making them both more predictable and more dangerous than any human enemy I'd ever faced. About halfway through our canal journey, we encountered evidence that other survivors had used this route before us. There were makeshift shelters constructed in the drainage alcoves, personal belongings scattered along the canal floor, and signs that people had tried to establish semi-permanent camps in the maintenance tunnels that connected to the main channel. But there were also clear indications that these refuges had been compromised. Bloodstains on the concrete walls, torn clothing, and the kind of destruction that comes when infected people find their way into confined spaces where potential victims have nowhere to run. I gathered the group around one of these abandoned campsites and used it as a teaching moment about survival decision-making. The people who had sheltered here had made logical choices based on the information available to them. The canal provided concealment from surface threats, the concrete walls offered protection from the elements, and the drainage system gave them multiple escape routes if they were discovered. But they'd made one critical error. They'd treated the canal like a permanent safe zone rather than a temporary route through hostile territory. Sarah asked me how I knew the difference, how I could tell whether a position was defensible for hours versus days versus weeks. I explained that it came down to understanding the nature of the threats you were facing and the resources available to sustain your position. The infected people we'd encountered were persistent hunters who would eventually find any stationary target if given enough time. The only way to stay ahead of them was to keep moving, using mobility and unpredictability to avoid being cornered in any one location. Kim wanted to know if the marina in San Diego would be different, if boats could provide the kind of long-term security that land-based positions couldn't offer. I told her that water created natural barriers that infected people couldn't cross, assuming they retained the motor functions and limitations of living human bodies. Boats also provided mobility that would allow us to relocate if a position became compromised, and access to marine resources that might be less affected by whatever had caused the outbreak in terrestrial environments. But I also warned her that reaching the marina was only the first step in what would probably be a much longer survival challenge. We didn't know how widespread the infection was, how long it might persist, or what kind of world we'd be dealing with once the immediate crisis passed. The boat would give us time and space to figure out those larger questions, but it wouldn't solve them automatically. As we continued through the canal, Pete made an observation that had been bothering me as well. The infected people we'd encountered seemed to retain some aspects of their human memories and motor skills, but they'd lost the higher cognitive functions that made them truly human. They could climb stairs, open doors, and navigate complex terrain, but they couldn't plan ahead, use tools effectively, or coordinate sophisticated group actions. This suggested that whatever was causing the infection attacked specific parts of the brain while leaving others intact. This had important tactical implications. The infected people would always be individually dangerous because they retained their physical capabilities and had no fear or pain to limit their actions. But they would always be strategically predictable because they couldn't adapt their behavior based on changing circumstances. If we could understand their basic operational patterns, we could stay ahead of them indefinitely by using planning and coordination they were incapable of matching. Around 3 a.m, we reached the end of the canal system and found ourselves at the edge of Phoenix's urban core. The industrial district gave way to scattered developments, and then to the desert terrain that surrounded the city. From our position in the canal, we could see the lights of military vehicles establishing positions along the major highways, but there were still gaps in their perimeter that we might be able to exploit. The challenge was that crossing from the canal to the open desert would require moving through about half a mile of exposed terrain, where we'd be visible to both military patrols and any infected people who might be wandering the area. The desert offered excellent concealment once we reached it, but getting there would be the most dangerous part of our entire escape attempt. I spent an hour studying the terrain between our position and the desert, looking for natural features we could use for concealment during the crossing. There was a dry wash that ran roughly parallel to our intended route, created by seasonal flooding that carved a shallow depression through the landscape. If we could reach the wash without being detected, we could use it to move toward the mountains while staying below the sightlines of surface observers. The timing had to be perfect. Military patrols seemed to be following regular patterns, probably coordinated by radio to ensure complete coverage of their assigned sectors. If I could identify the gaps in their patrol schedule, we might have a window of opportunity to cross the exposed area and reach the wash before the next patrol cycle brought them back to our section of the perimeter. I explained the plan to the others and made sure they understood the risks involved. Once we left the canal, we'd be committed to reaching the desert or being captured by the military. There would be no opportunity to retreat to our current position. If something went wrong, if we were detected during the crossing, our only options would be to surrender to the military and hope they didn't treat us as infected people, or to try to escape into the desert with armed soldiers pursuing us. Sarah asked what would happen if the military captured us, whether they'd take us to safety or treat us as potential carriers of whatever infection was spreading through Phoenix. I gave her the honest answer based on what I'd observed of their operational procedures. The military was treating the entire city as a contaminated zone, which suggested they were following biological warfare protocols that prioritized containment over individual rescue. Anyone found inside the quarantine perimeter would probably be assumed to be infected until proven otherwise, and the proving process might not be gentle. Kim wanted to know if there were any alternatives to crossing the exposed terrain, any other routes that might be safer even if they took longer. I showed her the topographical maps we'd taken from the house, pointing out that every route out of Phoenix involved crossing open ground at some point. The military had chosen their perimeter position specifically to control all the natural corridors that led away from the city. We could try to find a different crossing point, but we'd face similar challenges anywhere along the perimeter. Pete asked the most practical question: what specific action should each person take during the crossing to maximize our chances of success? I assigned each person a specific role and route, with instructions for what to do if we were detected, separated, or encountered unexpected obstacles. The key was maintaining discipline and following the plan even if circumstances changed, because improvisation during a high-risk operation usually led to mistakes that got people killed. We left the canal just after 4 in the morning, moving in single file toward the dry wash that would provide concealment during the most dangerous part of our crossing. The desert air was cold and clear, carrying sounds much farther than they would travel in an urban environment. Every footstep, every piece of equipment that shifted in our packs, every breath we took seemed amplified in the silence. The crossing to the wash took 20 minutes of careful movement across terrain that offered minimal concealment. We used scattered vegetation and slight variations in elevation to break up our silhouettes, moving during the gaps between military patrols, and freezing in place whenever we heard vehicles approaching our area. The discipline paid off, and we reached the wash without being detected by either the military perimeter or any infected people who might have been wandering the outskirts of the city. The wash provided excellent concealment, but challenging terrain. The bottom was filled with loose sand and scattered rocks that had been deposited by decades of flash flooding. Moving through it required careful attention to footing and noise discipline, because the sandy surface could easily give way under our weight and create the kind of commotion that would attract attention from the surrounding area. As we moved through the wash toward the foothills of the mountains that surrounded Phoenix, I started to believe we might actually make it out of the quarantine zone. The military patrols were focused on the obvious escape routes, and we were using terrain features they probably hadn't considered significant enough to monitor closely. More importantly, we were putting distance between ourselves and the infected people who were concentrated in the urban areas behind us. But that optimism was premature. About 2 miles from the canal, we encountered something that reminded me how quickly situations could change when dealing with an unpredictable enemy. The wash intersected with a concrete culvert that carried runoff under a secondary road, and as we approached the tunnel entrance, I heard sounds that made my blood run cold. Moaning, shuffling, and the distinctive vocal patterns I'd learned to associate with infected people. The culvert was occupied, probably by infected people who had wandered into it during their aimless searching and had become trapped or disoriented in the confined space. The tunnel was our most direct route through the road crossing, but it was also a potential death trap if we encountered infected people in an area where we'd have limited mobility and no room to maneuver. I had to make another tactical decision based on incomplete information. We could try to clear the culvert by engaging whatever infected people were inside, but that would create noise that might attract military patrols or additional infected people from the surrounding area. We could try to go around the road crossing by climbing out of the wash and moving overland, but that would expose us to observation and put us back in the kind of open terrain we'd been trying to avoid. Or we could use a technique I'd learned during my demolitions training for dealing with confined spaces that contained unknown threats. Instead of entering the culvert directly, we could create a distraction that would draw the infected people out of the tunnel and into the wash where we'd have more room to deal with them. The risk was that the distraction might also attract unwanted attention from other sources, but it was better than walking blind into a potential ambush. I explained the plan to the others and positioned them in defensive positions along the sides of the wash while I prepared to draw the infected people out of the culvert. Using techniques I'd learned for handling explosive devices in confined spaces, I created a noisemaker from materials in my pack and threw it into the tunnel entrance. The device would create intermittent sounds that would simulate human movement, hopefully convincing the infected people that prey had entered their territory. The strategy worked better than I'd expected. 4 infected people emerged from the culvert over the next few minutes, drawn by the sounds of my improvised device. They moved with the same focused intensity I'd observed before, but their movement through the sandy bottom of the wash was clumsy and uncoordinated. This gave us significant tactical advantages because we could engage them individually rather than dealing with a coordinated group attack. I used the same environmental manipulation techniques that had worked in the parking lot, using the terrain features of the wash to separate and disable the infected people without prolonged combat. The key was staying mobile and using their own momentum against them, letting the unstable footing and confined space work in our favor rather than theirs. Within 10 minutes, we'd neutralized all 4 infected people and confirmed that the culvert was clear for passage. But the engagement had cost us time we couldn't afford, and I was concerned that the noise might have attracted attention from military patrols, who were monitoring the area with electronic surveillance equipment. We moved through the culvert as quickly as possible, emerging on the far side, just as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon. The sight of sunrise should have been encouraging, because it meant we'd survived the night and were making progress toward our escape from the quarantine zone. But it also meant we were running out of darkness to conceal our movements, and the approaching daylight would make us much more vulnerable to detection by military patrols. The wash continued for another mile before it reached the base of the foothills, where the terrain became too steep and rocky for the seasonal floods that had carved the depression. From there, we have to climb into the mountains using game trails and natural features for concealment, working our way around the northern edge of Phoenix toward the highway that would take us to California. The mountain terrain offered excellent concealment but required different survival skills than the urban and desert environments we'd been navigating. The elevation changes would be physically demanding, especially for Sarah and Kim, who weren't accustomed to hiking in rough country. The rocky terrain would be hard on our feet and equipment, and the temperature variations between day and night would require careful management of our limited resources. But the mountains also offered something we hadn't had since leaving the hospital: the possibility of finding water sources that weren't controlled by either the military or infected people. The topographical maps showed several seasonal streams that might still have water this time of year, and there were areas of vegetation that suggested permanent springs might be accessible if we knew where to look. As we began climbing into the foothills, I started thinking about the next phase of our journey. Getting out of Phoenix was only the first step in reaching the marina in San Diego. We still had to cross almost 300 miles of desert and mountain terrain, avoid military checkpoints on the major highways, and deal with whatever infected people might be scattered through the smaller towns between Phoenix and the coast. But I was also thinking about the teaching responsibilities I'd taken on at the marina, the sailing lessons I'd been giving to kids from the community center. Those kids had learned basic seamanship and water safety, but more importantly, they'd learned to work together as a crew and to think of the ocean as a place of opportunity rather than danger. If even a few of them had made it to the marina when the outbreak started, they might have followed the emergency protocols. I'd taught them and established a floating safe zone that could accommodate additional survivors. The possibility that some of my students might still be alive and waiting at the marina gave me additional motivation to complete the journey. But it also reminded me of the responsibilities that came with survival. If we made it to San Diego, if we found safety on the water, we'd have an obligation to help other survivors who were facing the same challenges we'd overcome. The boat would give us mobility and security, but it would also make us a potential rescue platform for people who were still trapped in the infected zones. As the sun came up over the mountains east of Phoenix, I looked back at the city we were leaving behind. Smoke was still rising from multiple locations. The skyline was broken by dark patches where the power grid had failed, and I could see military vehicles positioning themselves to complete the quarantine perimeter. Whatever Phoenix had been before the outbreak, it was gone forever. The city I could see in the growing daylight was a tomb, a monument to how quickly civilization could collapse when faced with a threat it wasn't prepared to handle. But we were alive, we were free, and we were moving toward safety. The marina was still 250 miles away, across terrain that would test everything we'd learned about survival and teamwork. But we'd already accomplished something that most people in Phoenix would never have the chance to attempt. We'd escaped from a quarantine zone, evaded both infected people and military patrols, and maintained our humanity in a situation that could have easily reduced us to the same predatory instincts that drove the creatures hunting through the city below. The desert stretched ahead of us, vast and unforgiving, but also clean of the infection that had turned our neighbors into monsters. Somewhere beyond that desert was the ocean, and on that ocean was a boat that could carry us away from the nightmare that had consumed the world we'd known. The journey would be dangerous, but for the first time since I'd heard those first screams in the hospital corridor, I believed we might actually survive to see whatever came after the outbreak. The coordinates tattooed on my wrist had guided U.S. out of Phoenix, just as they'd helped my unit navigate to safety during our final mission in Syria. But now we were writing new coordinates, creating a new map of survival that might help other people find their way through the darkness that had fallen over the world. The marina was our destination, but it was also our beginning. The place where we'd start building whatever came next in a world where the dead walked among the living and safety could only be found on the endless blue expanse of the ocean.